we've got to do better. If we can't get them to speak up when they're in this safe environment of a school, like what's going to happen when they leave?
If one of the key principles of cold calling is that students have a good chance of getting right, having an educated guess, what would you suggest if a student just says, I don't know?
Or you're quite quiet, should participate more. And then you think, well, that student's probably had that feedback from every single teacher.
Yeah.
And we're putting the burden on the child.
How long can some of your students go without vocally participating if not prompted? And the number used to really shock me.
Oh my word, that girl has been in our school for 7 years.
Yeah.
And yet she's still at that stage where she doesn't feel comfortable speaking up in a upper sixth class.
Are you looking for brilliant CPD that is inspiring, illuminating and impactful? Well, Inner Drive's training is evidence-informed, engaging and makes a real difference. Whether it is in person at your training days or online through our Teachers CPD Academy, Inner Drive is transforming how schools and colleges do professional development. Email us at info@innerdrive.co.uk to take your staff training to the next level.
Hello and welcome to Inner Drive's Science of Learning podcast with me, Bradley Bush, the podcast where we'll discuss the latest and greatest cognitive science and educational studies, because we believe there is absolute gold and indeed dynamite in the research, and if we can make it accessible and put in front of the right people, i.e. you, our lovely listeners, and indeed our lovely subscribers, it can be transformational in the lives of students. In each episode, we will discuss 3 studies. Some are seminal, some are recent, all are illuminating. When we discuss a key cognitive science principle, you will hear the principle ping. And when we discuss the nuance of application, you will hear the nuance noise, which today sounds like this. In this episode, and indeed what an episode it is, I'm joined by the one and only Dr. Claire Badger, talking all things cold calling. Claire, welcome to the pod.
Thanks very much. Brilliant to be here.
How are you doing?
Really well, thank you.
So I guess we should say, for just some context for this pod, we worked together. I worked for your previous school when you were head of teaching and learning there.
Yep.
And you've joined us now at Inner Drive.
Yep.
Head of teacher professional development.
Absolutely. You got the job title right. Well done.
Very good. I've been practicing that. And a lot of what you do within Inner Drive is talking to schools and colleges about how do you help students learn better and faster and translate some of the research. And a big part of that is around questions and indeed cold calling and
Absolutely.
participation. So that's what we're going to cover today.
Brilliant.
So we've got 3 studies, which I think are all of them fascinating studies. I think they're studies that everyone should know about. Let's jump straight in, shall we?
Let's.
Okay, so I thought I'd kick us off with the first study. So the first study I think is very timely when lots of schools and colleges are focusing on retrieval, on getting all students to think hard, and indeed oracy. This study for me provides a real good indicator as to why things like cold calling are so important. So I thought the first studies we'll look at the study that sets the scene, and then we'll do 2 specific cold calling studies later on in the episode.
Sounds great.
So the first study by Sadova and Sadalec in 2023, a really cool study, right? So what they did is they had hundreds of teenagers, I think about 600 teenagers, and they tracked these students over a period of time to see like which students do the best, which students learn at the fastest rate. And they measured, and this is like the key part, 2 different characteristics or 2 different behaviours of the students. So one of the behaviours that they looked at is what they call vocal participation. So vocal participation is how much did the students answer the teacher's questions, how much did they get involved in like class discussions or group discussions, you kind of like turn and talk or think, pair, share. So that's the first measure, is vocal participation. The second measure is what they called silent engagement, which is basically, I think, a fancy way of saying how much did the students pay attention in class, how much were they really switched on compared to how much did they like daydream or get distracted or just focus on the wrong things. So we've got 2 distinct areas, vocal participation and silent engagement. Now, unsurprisingly, if we look at the results, students who make the most progress who learnt the most did both vocal participation and silent engagement a lot. So they were highly vocal and paying lots of attention. The researchers call these the eager students. Now, I know eager sometimes has like negative connotations, but I think the researchers meant it in a really positive way. So unsurprisingly, if you pay attention and you talk about the material, you're probably going to do a lot of learning, right? So these students outperformed all other students. They outperformed what the researchers call the chatty students. The chatty students are the ones who are quite happy to talk. Their vocal participation is high, but perhaps they don't think too much about what they're actually saying.
We can all think of a chatty student that we've taught.
Dare I say it myself when I was at school, so that's a good one. So the eager students outperform the chatty students. They outperform the diligent students. So the diligent students are the ones they say, these are the students who they do think hard, they do pay attention, but perhaps they lack the confidence to insert themselves in the conversation, that they're not the most vocal in the class. I think diligent students are an interesting area because they do pay attention. If there's no behavioural challenges, very easy for them to fly under the radar because they kind of, just quietly get on with it.
Absolutely.
And then the lowest performing group, really unsurprising, is students who do neither. They don't vocally participate, they don't pay attention. The researchers call these like the aloof or the disconnected students. And there's many different things I think we can look at from this study. It's a really interesting study. One of the things I find quite interesting is if we were to compare the eager students with the diligent students, both of them pay attention, both of them engage, but only one of them really vocally participates. And as a result, they do significantly different in their learning. And I guess it just begs the question, it's quite an awkward question I sometimes ask schools when we go in and we do our training and CPD and inset days. How long can some of your students go without vocally participating if not prompted? And the number used to really shock me. I think it's now fairly common when I ask that question for people to say, unprompted, I think some of our students could easily go a whole year without vocally participating in class. And what this study suggests is that's a real missed opportunity. There's a potential learning loss because of that. I thought I'd just see from your experience, does that chime with your experience when you used to teach? How long do you think some of your students could go without vocally participating? What's been your experience of that?
Yeah, I remember really vividly when you came into my old school and presented this study, and that sort of penny drop moment when you asked that question, and we, as a group of staff, sort of went through and we're just like, oh, wow, actually, maybe they could go that long. So it really makes you think, this study, and you really realise just how important it is speaking up. And I then was having conversations with various staff after your workshop. And I remember chatting to one colleague who about this, and him saying, well, there's in my upper sixth class, there's one girl in there. She just doesn't really speak up, and kind of that's fine. I know she's thinking, I know she's concentrating. And I sort of reflected on that. I thought, oh my word, that girl has been in our school for 7 years.
Yeah.
And yet she's still at that stage where she doesn't feel comfortable speaking up in a upper sixth class, which is quite small. And I think that sort of idea we've done as a school that girl a disservice by actually not encouraging her to speak up. So those are my sort of big reflections on this. Just, we've got to do better. If we can't get them to speak up when they're in this safe environment of a school, like, what's going to happen when they leave?
Exactly. And I guess what I find interesting, I think it's important to emphasise, is we're not saying, this study isn't suggesting diligent students can't do well. Like, lots of diligent students do really well. I think basically what it's saying, though, is you don't have to be loud, you don't have to be an extrovert, but if we're not getting students to vocally participate, sometimes we therefore have to guess what's in their head.
Yeah.
Not only do we have to guess what's in their head, but the very act of them vocally participating helps them clarify what they think as well. And so it's just so important, essentially.
Yeah, because I think that the sort of students that I taught, they'd be very happy to sit there quietly and spend hours and hours and hours after school sort of sorting things out.
Yeah.
Whereas I think actually if you got them to vocalise things in the class, they would then realise they didn't quite understand, or they'd reveal a misconception, and then you could deal with it then and there, and not have to, not for them to then have to spend ages afterwards. So
completely. And there were a couple quotes that kind of caught my eye in the study that I think really get to the heart of the issue. So the first one, I'll read it out to you. They said, Teachers should incite all students to participate in classroom conversations, as the inequalities in student talk can create uneven learning opportunities.
Yeah, that's nice.
It's good that, right? Because
Yeah.
for someone like me, when I was at school, who was quite chatty, quite loud, you know, I would insert myself into the conversation and I would be more than happy to put my hand up. And if you ask me my opinion even now, I'm more than happy to give you my opinion.
Yeah.
But learning shouldn't only be for those students. Like, it should be for everyone. And whether you have the confidence to insert yourself into the conversation or not, we should create structures and strategies that draw you in.
Absolutely.
essentially.
And I think it's that idea that it's part of our responsibility as teachers. And I look back in horror at some of, you know, the reports and the parents' evenings that I kind of gave, and, you know, feedback to students saying, oh, you're quite quiet, you know, should participate more. And then you think, well, that student's probably had that feedback from every single teacher.
Yeah.
And we're putting the burden on the child to insert themselves in when they've got all of those, you know, teenage hormones and everything going in. So I think reflecting back on what I can do as a practitioner to bring them in,
Yeah.
that's where I think this study becomes really, really powerful.
And that thing about teenagers is particularly interesting. So I'll talk about that in a second, because I think this stuff applies across the whole board, right? So in primary school, sometimes, you know, I think it's more common, there might be more chatty students while their impulse control and self-regulation
Yeah.
is still developing. Making sure that there is an even contribution from all students, I think is really important. But if we look at teenagers, we know that the way the teenage brain works, social status and belonging to the group is real.
So powerful.
It's so powerful. It's paramount to them. And the researchers touch on this. They say adolescent students feel tension between enjoying learning and belonging to the peer group in class, which is interesting, right? Because two things are happening there. Is like learning and getting better is motivating.
Yeah.
It does boost confidence. People usually want to learn stuff, but also I want to be accepted by my peers.
Yeah.
And if there's a culture that means it's not cool to participate, it's not cool to volunteer and put yourself forward, unfortunately for many teenagers, that will trump their desire to learn.
Yeah.
And that's so prevalent in your adolescent years.
Absolutely. There's one study I read a long time ago about how teenagers feel social pain the same as physical pain. And I think when you sort of reflect, just that's how powerful that social exclusion is, or how that powerful a draw social inclusion is. I think that really helps you to understand why we, as I said, we need to create those environments so they feel more comfortable participating. But it's a real tough one with all students, like you say, whether they're primary or secondary, but certainly the teenage hormones that kick in and those sort of social factors are enormous.
So talking about like the teenage hormones, there was I saw a great talk by Professor Sarah Jane Blakemore.
Oh yeah,
So she spoke at our Teaching and Learning Summit.
I remember very well. She was brilliant.
She was absolutely brilliant. I think her work and her research and her books are on this area are fantastic. And one of the things she talked about, so she used smoking as an example. So the physical risk of smoking is well known.
Yeah.
Like in 30 years' time, it massively increases the chances of you getting lung cancer. Like we know that risk. For teenagers, the risk of not smoking, being social exclusion and not being part of the in-group, you've got two different types of risks. But the very physical risk isn't more important than that psychological risk of being excluded from the group. And you see that same mindset play out in many classrooms where people behave differently when they're part of a group.
Yeah.
And we therefore, when we talk a lot about cognitive science and the science of learning, we also do have to talk about the social psychology aspect, and being part of the group is a big part of that.
Absolutely. I also think there's a timescale thing there, in that social exclusion is immediate and real, whereas learning's a much longer timescale thing. So you sort of know it's important eventually, but that's like a tomorrow problem.
Yeah.
Whereas the today problem is like, I don't want to look silly in front of my mates right now.
Yeah.
Even though at the back of your mind, you sort of know, well, maybe you should be, you know, thinking more about your learning. But like I said, it's the tomorrow problem. And that's even more of an influence, I think, for teenagers.
And that for me right there is why self-selection as a means of participation is a really weak form of communication. So for the avoidance of doubt, when we talk about like self-selection is traditionally, I ask a question, X number of students put their hands up in the air, and there's this kind of psychological contract that we all understand is I will only ask you if you put your hands up.
Yeah.
And if you don't put your hands up, I won't come ask you. And And if we're putting all that responsibility for their learning on them to decide whether they want to participate, it's a really weak pedagogical approach, right?
Yeah, completely.
And that for me is one of the many reasons why I think cold calling is so, so important, because it puts the onus on us, the professionals, as the adults. And it means that we can ensure there isn't this inequality of talk, and that everyone is thinking and everyone is participating.
Yeah, I think that's really true. So that leads us nicely on to the study I wanted to talk about here.
So I'm a bit gutted that you're taking a lead on this study because I love this study. So I will do my best to not jump in every 10 seconds, but I promise nothing.
I get to talk about it.
Yeah, go for it.
Because I love this study as well. This is a Dallimore et al. Study from 2012, and they were specifically addressing that concern that cold calling causes students to be anxious in class or uncomfortable. Yeah. And just the definition of cold calling they use in this paper is a teacher calls on a student whose hand is not raised. So absolutely, like you say, we're going against that selection thing.
And just on that note, that anxious worry, this is always, you hear this all the time with cold calling, right? Like, I don't want to stress out my students.
Yeah.
Have you had that objection in the past?
Absolutely.
Did you have that objection when you first heard of cold calling? How big a fear do you think that is in the profession? Right.
Massive. There's something about, I think it's that sort of like, the thing about teachers, you don't want to cause students to be anxious. Most teachers go into teaching because they like children. And therefore, I think it sort of goes against your instincts about respecting students and respecting them.
And do you think the name doesn't help? So cold calling is one of two things. It's either sales, like someone's calling you up when you're eating dinner.
I hadn't thought about that.
And it's just annoying. Like, I haven't called you. You've called me at an inconvenient time. And you're just a telemarketer.
Yeah.
And also the name, it includes the name cold.
Cold,
Yeah, and we're like, who wants to be cold?
Yeah, that probably is part of it. I hadn't thought about the telemarketing aspect. I used to sort of talk about in school, like cold calling in a warm way.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of, when you're talking about doing it in a really supportive, collaborative way, I think that helps overcome some of that.
Yeah.
But it is the name used in the research.
You're right.
So I think that's one of the reasons if we start calling it something different, then are we still talking about the same thing? So I think it's one of those, Yeah, so
what did the study find? Did it make the students more anxious? What else did they find then?
Well, spoiler alert, no, it didn't.
Yeah.
But I would like you to give you all the details, if that's all right, about how they got there.
Yeah, go for it.
So what they were doing in this study, they watched a variety of lessons in a particular educational setting. Yeah. And when they watched those lessons, they classified them into environments where there was a high amount of cold calling and environments where there was a low amount of cold calling. So just the nature of that teacher and the culture they set up.
So basically like cold calling versus self-selection.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. Exactly. And then they measured, what they were measuring was the percentage of students who volunteered to answer questions.
Yeah.
And they went in at two different time points. They went in early on in the year and then they went back a few years later.
Yeah.
A few weeks later. And in those low cold calling environments, they found about 55% of the students, they participated, they volunteered at the beginning of the year. Scroll forward a few weeks, nothing has changed. So it's exactly the same amount. So you've got those kind of social norms, those eager students are participating, the diligent ones are, that sort of thing.
Which is interesting, right? I like that nothing changes.
Yeah.
Like how quickly the unwritten rules are established.
Yeah, and that's when we know that teenagers like to kind of put themselves into groups, or any child actually, but certainly.
So like we're the ones who participate, we're the ones who don't. Never the twain shall meet.
Exactly.
I often think that's kind of a bit like a game of chicken. So like I would say, if you're one of the students who don't participate and you know that you're not going to get called on, really, you just have to hold your nerve for longer. It's like, can I just stay quiet and embrace the awkwardness? Because either Claire's going to go to someone else, or Claire will completely bottle it and just give the answer herself.
Absolutely.
And so it's basically an unspoken game of chicken going on, essentially.
That's a good way of thinking about it. Certainly, I think the temptation as a teacher is to go to the student that you know will give you the right answer, because then you feel good about it, they feel good about it, and you just lull yourself into this false sense of security that everyone in the room understands.
Yeah.
So it's I can absolutely understand why, as teachers, we're reluctant to call on everyone in the room. Like it could go wrong. You could find out
You're
that they
off script
don't.
at that moment.
Yeah,
aren't you,
exactly.
Okay, so not much cold calling, basically half the group participate and nothing changes over the course of like a half term or so.
But if you've got these cold calling environments, there's a bit more increase right at the beginning of the year. So it was 68% who volunteered.
Yeah.
But the reason I think the study is so powerful is when you scroll forward those few weeks, that number rockets to 86% of those students are voluntarily participating. So you've broken those social norms, you've broken those unwritten rules, you're encouraging everyone.
I think the part I find interesting is that keyword he says is voluntarily. It's like these are students who within a couple of weeks want to participate.
Exactly.
They feel, for whatever reason, we can talk about maybe some of the mechanisms as to what causes them to like want to participate. But like, you've pretty much got all the class wanting to be involved in the class discussion.
And they specifically addressed that anxiety issue. They surveyed the students and asked them, and as I said, they don't find it uncomfortable. There's a really nice quote I'd like to read to you. So this is what the researchers said about that uncomfortable thing. Cold calling encourages students to prepare more and to participate more frequently. The more they prepare and the more frequently they participate, the more comfortable they become when participating. So it's like a positive feedback loop. You know, you prepare more, you feel more confident. I think that success breeds motivation thing. Like it doesn't cause students to be more anxious. I think that's really powerful.
Interesting, because so we should give a shout out to Doug Lemov, whose work on cold calling has really brought it into the mainstream. We've got a partnership with him. We do a number of projects through our Teach CPD Academy with him. And so I pick his brains every now and again on cold calling. And we shared this study with him. And it kind of, the way he kind of summed it up is not only does cold calling make you less anxious, if you don't do cold calling, then if students don't often participate, this fear builds up. That this big one-off event, which is really stress inducing. And the way he described it to me was, he said, maybe we unintentionally validate their fears because we go, oh, you're right, you're not someone who participates, so therefore I won't call on you, and therefore in their mind actually builds up their insecurity. So you can see how cold calling is actually a very, if done in the right way, it's really kind, if anything.
Absolutely. I think it's one of the most inclusive strategies we have for teaching.
100%.
And as you say, you can end up in positive feedback loops and downward spirals as well.
So if we've got students who are participating more and feeling less anxious, in my mind, what that means is not only are they becoming more confident, but they're becoming more competent as well. Like if you do stuff regularly, you get better at it.
Absolutely.
And if you get better at it, you feel more confident at it. So it's kind of like a positive cycle.
Absolutely. The research had a nice phrase for it, actually. They called it prime the pump, which I really liked as a phrase.
What do they mean by prime the pump?
This idea that the more you do something, the better you become at it. So because you are practicing speaking in front of people, suddenly you're not so anxious about speaking in front of people, so you get better at speaking in front of people. They also drew in the fact that there's comfort in numbers. Like, is everyone speaking? Then it's okay for me to speak. So
this is just what we do here.
This is just the norms. This is what's expected. So I like those phrases.
I like that. Prime the pump.
I
think that's a good phrase.
One, isn't it?
I like that. In terms of giving tips on how to do cold calling better, so I think this study provides real vindication for why it's a good strategy. You see more participation rates. You see more students wanting to do it, and they're less anxious about participating. In terms of how to do it better, did the researchers give any advice with regards to that?
They did indeed. They had three things that they particularly highlighted. The first was setting out your expectations. So just explaining to students that this is what's going to happen. They're going to be called on to answer questions, whether or not they've raised their hand. I think that's quite important to kind of explain to students what you're doing.
Yeah, I think Doug calls that a rollout.
Which that's his phrase. I like that. Doesn't take long, but just make sure they know.
And I guess the reason for doing that is, in a student's mind, it's quite easy for it to be misinterpreted as Claire is picking on me.
Exactly.
Whereas actually what this is saying is we should tell them we're doing this because we care about their opinion and it's going to help them learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Another Doug phrase that I like is that invitation to join the discussion. I'm inviting you to participate because I care what you think and your opinions matter in this room and things like that.
Yeah, that's nice.
That's nice. The second thing that the researchers in this paper had was about making sure that there's time to reflect and respond. So it's not just me as a teacher calling on you as a student and saying, yes, that's right, moving on to the next student, which is very kind of short, superficial kind of conversations. Is much more about like, here's my question, time to think, jot down your initial ideas on a bit of paper or a mini whiteboard or something, turn and talk to your partner, sort of get them to rehearse answers. When they answer, that's a great start, Brad, you know, can you help me out, Caroline? That sort of stuff. So you're bouncing it around the room rather than just like statically like Q&A just between teacher and student.
Interesting. So that think, pair, share that you mentioned. So I recently, for our academy, interviewed an incredible researcher, a guy called Dr. Mendelsee. I think he's based in Germany. And his whole area of research is around how do we encourage shy students to participate more? And he was saying doing an initial think, pair, share is like transformational for our more nervous and shy students, because either they get to get some initial validation from just one peer, so instead of the whole class start with, they get to hear their partner's answer and therefore build on their own. So by the time that they're then cold called upon, they know they've got a good, secure answer, and they feel way less stressed about it.
Absolutely. I think part of it is literally just that rehearsal. Like the first time you say something, you slightly stumble over your words and things like that. And then the second time you don't make quite the same mistake. So even that I've said the answer once before and now I can say it again helps. But again, that sort of feedback from peers and things helps.
We should totally do an episode on think, pair, share and some of the research.
Yeah. There's some great stuff out there.
On that. Okay, so we got expectations. Time to
reflect and respond.
Anything else?
And then the third one is just making sure it's in a really supportive learning environment. So I think where cold calling goes wrong, if it's used as a behaviour management technique, this sort of like, oh, gotcha, you weren't paying attention sort of thing. We want students to be successful as much as we can. So to sort of set that up if they, you know, and have strategies for if they do get it wrong and say, oh, actually, thanks so much for sharing that. That's actually a really common misconception. Lots of people think that is not quite right because, so just sort of really set it up so students are less afraid of failure. And as I say, some of that reflect and respond can help with that as well.
So my main question I want to ask you on that then is if it's not a behaviour management strategy, so it's not saying I see Claire not paying attention or talking to her friend, I'm going to cold call her to embarrass her into paying attention. So if it's not that, I guess I think that's quite lovely actually about cold calling. For cold calling to work well, we want people to have a really good chance of getting the answer right. Like we know retrieval practice is more successful when it's difficult, but they have a good chance of getting it right. And I think the same thing with cold calling is because it's not random. I'm calling on a particular student for a particular reason. And one of those reasons is because I know how much you know. I can have a rough guess on your prior knowledge. I'm calling on you because I think you have a good chance of getting it right. So I'm never doing it as a way to embarrass someone into paying attention, or if I think there's no chance they've got it right. If anything, it's saying you, the teacher, are the expert in this room. You know your students. You're calling on the student for a particular reason. And one of that reasons is you know they've got a good chance of getting it right. And I think when you frame it like that, people who might be a bit more skeptical about cold calling suddenly be much more open to it.
Yeah, because I think that comes down to that fear that, oh, what if they do give me the wrong answer? And actually, if you kind of think it more in terms of setting it up so they're very likely to give you a good answer, maybe one that isn't perfect, one that can be built on and improved, but you've set it up so the likelihood is that you're going to get the right answer, then I think that's one way to have that supportive learning environment.
So if one of the key principles of cold calling is that students have a good chance of getting it right, having an educated guess, what would you then suggest if, with all the good intention and all the goodwill in the world, what would you suggest if a student just says, I don't know? Because I think that's one of the reasons why people worry about cold calling is, well, what do I do if I just get essentially either a refuser or someone who just doesn't know?
Absolutely. I think there's several things you can do. First of all, you do need to unpick a little bit about why they're saying, I don't know. Sometimes it is literally they weren't paying attention. And therefore, you know, having a strategy say, that's not a problem. Could you just repeat the question back to me? So just something like that. And then they'll quickly realise if that's the culture you have in the class, that they do need to pay attention. And I don't know can't be used as just a get out of jail free card. Sometimes they might genuinely not know, and that I think is perfectly reasonable. Sometimes kids don't. You know, you do all the best will in the world to set it up for success. They might genuinely not know, and then I think a really good strategy is to say that's absolutely not a problem. Go to someone else, and then come back to that person. Say, not a problem. I'll come back to you.
Yep.
Brad, what do you think? And then the thing to remember is to go back to that person so that they then have a chance to repeat the correct answer. So then they're retrieving the correct answer. They're more likely then to not say, I don't know, when that same question gets asked next time.
Okay, so let me ask you a trickier question then.
God.
That's one of the things you do if a student says, I don't know.
Yeah.
If a student just gets it wrong,
Yeah.
how do you balance being encouraging? Because I do want to create this environment that's really supportive, that rewards effort and engagement, versus I don't want to be patronizing, because I think students, if you're inauthentic and you give almost like false praise, they pick on that really quickly. How do you get that balance between being supportive that they get the answer wrong versus you do have to acknowledge that it is wrong and we need to get to the right information?
Yeah. I sometimes was quite bad. I've got really bad facial expressions. So I'm really bad at hiding my thoughts. So I had to go out quite hard not to be like, you what now? Where on earth has that come from?
Yeah.
So I think kind of being aware of those things and the idea that mostly they are common misconceptions. So acknowledging that I think helps, you know, thanks so much for sharing. A lot of people think that, but actually it's not quite right.
Yeah.
Because, and then I think sometimes the way we get it wrong is we do what I've heard call as rounding up.
Right.
So we hear it's not a totally wrong answer, but it's not quite right. And we sort of say, yeah, that's great. And then we use like the right vocabulary in there, or we sort of repeat it where it's actually correct. And we think we're being helpful there to the student. The student doesn't notice the difference.
Yeah.
They think they've got it perfect. Whereas and sometimes you just say, oh yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
And then you round up. So I think that's actually not helping that learner ultimately.
Okay, so hopefully I think this study's done a real good justification of the importance of cold calling, but more than that, looking at how to do it better as well. Because we do want all students paying attention, we want all students thinking hard, and from that earlier study, we want all students vocally participating
Absolutely.
at times. And this also gives an indication of how to do it with explaining why we're doing it, having high expectations, being supportive and warm, as well as giving that reflection time kind of prior to it. You mentioned in that study, we were talking about it there, you mentioned the phrase you think it's the most inclusive means of participation.
Yeah.
Because essentially it's a form of what's known like it's voice equity.
Yeah.
It's saying that everyone has the right to participate and you care about everyone's opinion. I'm going to take it one step further as to why I absolutely agree it being the most inclusive form of participation, which is the third study that I thought we'd talk about, because it's not a very well-known study, and I think it should be.
Yeah.
So hopefully we can do our best to illuminate it and shine a spotlight on it.
Yeah.
So the lead researcher was the same one in the study that you spoke about, so another study by Dallimore. The two main findings for me in this study, so the first one confirms what they found in your study that you mentioned, was that it increases the rate of volunteered participation. So more students participate and want to participate and don't feel stressed about it in environments where there's lots of cold calling.
Yeah. It's always nice to have like confirmation of studies where you get the same. It's not just a one-off.
So much so, because I think if we are going to be a serious profession and really draw on evidence, we need a weight of evidence. And sadly, in other areas of psychology, there's this whole area of this like replication crisis, where some interventions you get these big results and they just fail to
Never see it
replicate.
again.
And interestingly enough, you don't tend to see that in cognitive science. You tend to see it more in the social psychology. So there's lots of studies around like nudging people into doing different behaviours. Whereas if you look at the studies on retrieval, on spacing, on cold calling, you tend to get pretty consistent replications, and I think that's really important. They get less headlines, because everyone wants like new.
What's the best? What's the newest thing? But actually, you know, the replication stuff, it's important.
It's huge, right? So I like that for this study, that it just adds more weight to that idea of it increases participation without increasing anxiety, but it adds something new as well. And here's the interesting thing that they did in this study: they looked at if you don't do much cold calling, so typically self-selection, only hands up, male students tend to dominate the discussion by some significant margin. And yet when we do lots of cold calling, what they found is the distribution is much more evenly spread. And that's really interesting for me because when you think about it logically, it makes total sense. So who benefits the most from cold calling? The answer is the group who tend to be drowned out the most in self-selection.
Yeah.
Who is that usually? Often the loudest or people who rush to give an answer. And what this study is showing is typically there tends to be male students.
Yeah.
And this is what the study, I think it was even in the title of the study, they literally talk about how it evens the playing field.
Yeah, it's a nice phrase.
It's a really nice phrase. And it evens it by raising everyone up.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really important. And we are in a time currently where there is a big focus on inclusion
Yeah.
and on belonging.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say we should always be in that time.
Yeah,
That should never be a topical thing, but it is certainly more in people's sights at the moment. And when we're talking about that, what does inclusion in some part means? It means everyone has the right to participate and everyone has the right to have their voice heard and respected. And cold calling is a way that we can help shape that environment. And so I wanted to ask you particularly about this idea of the benefit of cold calling for shy girls. You spent a lot of time in your career working in girls' schools.
Yeah.
Does this chime with your experiences, both from your own teaching experience and also you now go work with lots of schools and colleges, all over?
Yeah.
What are people saying to you when you talk about this sort of stuff?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's just bringing it out into the open, this idea that it is really inclusive. I don't think people necessarily immediately jump on cold calling as being inclusive.
Yeah.
As soon as you share research like this, like you say, people start to think about it just like, oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. And they recognise their classroom environments, which may be dominated by those chatty students.
Yeah.
So I think certainly just it's a good conversation starter. Certainly in my own experience, I worked in a lot of academically selective schools throughout my career, actually. And in those types of schools, you do have much more of a fear of failure, I think. These people have been selected to come in and they're worried about losing that status as being super bright.
Yeah.
So that was something that really resonated with me with these studies on this. They just don't want to look stupid in front of their teachers or their friends or whoever it is. So the way for me in my teaching, again, it came down to the why, but often this was then having individual conversations. So rather than just explaining like the rollout to the whole class, there'd be specific students in the class that you knew were shyer.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'd have a pupil passport that said explicitly things like doesn't like being cold called.
Yeah.
And I would push back against that a little bit by sort of talking to them about the reasons why. But also I'd sort of set it up so they were less likely to fail. So, they'd be doing some independent practice, you'd circulate round, you'd see some answers, and you sort of turn to the child and sort of say, you know what, that's a really great answer. I really, really like what you've done there. When we do the class feedback in a bit, I'm going to call on you to answer that one. So they knew it was coming.
Yeah.
And they knew it was right. And then that sort of fueled, again, like we were saying earlier, that sort of positive feedback loop.
Yeah.
So that's one way I sort of use that cold calling and bring in those those more reluctant students.
So let's talk about this idea of these kind of student passports and this idea that some students shouldn't be cold called upon, because I get asked this a lot.
Yeah, me too.
It's probably one of the most common questions that I get asked. Where I find it really interesting, so just for a bit of context. So my wife, she's a child psychologist. And so she does a lot of work around autism and ADHD diagnosis, essentially. So we have this discussion around the dining room table all the time, because I typically work with schools who teachers talk about they have to balance the needs of the whole class, and she works with individual students. And so she's always advocating for the individual student. And there's a really interesting discussion to be had there. And so I asked her about this. I said, what would you say for people saying we shouldn't cold call on students? They're seeing an increase in the parents of students essentially opting out. So I asked her this question. The other person I asked this question to, as a side note, is a guy you might know, Gary Orban,
who I think
is just phenomenal.
Amazing.
Wrote The Lone Senko. Luckily, he agreed with my wife. So now two people who I think are amazing say the same thing. So now I think that thing. The way that my wife and indeed Gary phrased it to me was the question, should we cold call or not some students, is the wrong question.
Yes.
They said the question we should be asking is, what can we do so that in X number of weeks, that student has the skills and the strategies and feels comfortable being cold called upon.
Nice.
Because every student should participate. And some of the strategies you were talking about around front loading the praise, around giving them a bit of extra support or scaffolding, maybe what you said earlier about the think, pair, share, that can be part of the scaffold that they learn this skill, essentially. And I think that's a nice way of phrasing it. So I think my answer is, if you ever see something that says don't call the student, and that is being written by a trained medical professional doctor who in their professional experience has given that as a key recommendation diagnosis, we should 100%
completely.
Honor
there will
that.
be some exceptions who absolutely, for whatever, like you say, medical reasons, should not be speaking up in front of the class, and that's fine.
But that is a very, very, very small minority. We are not talking about shy or nervous students. No. For those students, I actually think we have a moral responsibility, as you said earlier, to draw them in and make them feel confident and comfortable, because when they leave your setting, they won't have that luxury of opting out. So I'd rather they learn that skills in this warm and nurturing way under your care, as opposed to kicking the can down the road.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And that's why for some students, you might need, I like your idea of scaffolding it. So you are having the one-to-one conversations with a few students. You don't need to do that with everyone. You are walking around and you're targeting the ones you know that are a bit more nervous, and you're teeing them up. And then in my experience, absolutely, then, 4 or 5 weeks into term, actually they suddenly put their hand up to answer a question, which, they'd never done before. And if you speak to them about other classes, they weren't doing that. So you do get this real kind of sense that, actually they do feel comfortable, but you just need to be a bit more patient maybe with them than some others.
And so just going back to the gender thing, which was what this study was.
Sorry.
Go
off on a tangent.
But this is the beautiful thing about research, is like it always prompts more questions and conversations than actual answers. I find the gender difference stuff really interesting. Because it's basically a minefield. And yet we know there are certain differences on average between groups. What I find really fascinating is a lot of these differences have got nothing to do with biology. Like, so much of them are like cultural messages that people get given as a child growing up. So one of my favourite studies looked at, they got parents of babies to predict. They said, how steep a hill can your baby crawl up, essentially? And parents of boys massively overestimated how steep they thought their kid could climb up this gradient.
No way.
Parents of daughters massively underestimated. Wow. And so we start to see some of these messages come sometimes quite subtly, but from a really early age. You look at there's a great viral thread on Twitter, now X, around the messaging on clothes. If you go into like department stores, if you go into the boys' department stores, they get very different messaging around being explorers and being adventurous and taking risks and trains. Whereas if you look at a lot of the messaging on the girls' clothes, a lot more is about being presentable and being a princess and being kind. And so you see, if we're just bombarded with these different types of messages, perhaps it's no surprise 15 years later we have different levels of participation on average amongst the group, which again means it makes the culture of what happens within the four walls of each person's classroom and indeed their school so important, because we have to overcome
some of those things.
Some of those things.
And be aware of some of those biases I think we have as teachers, like, that sort of the Pygmalion effect research out there that talks about, if you expect people to behave in this particular way, they usually do. You expect them to do well. So if you're expecting all the boys to be really noisy and loud and be having to keep an eye on them the whole time for behaviour management, then you might unintentionally be ignoring the girls just because you're focused so much on the boys and trying to calm them down because your expectation is that their behaviour is going to be worse.
And that's why the more I look into it, the more I hate self-selection. Because it doesn't trump any of those biases. It doesn't do anything to combat some terrible mixed messages that people have got as a result of what society pushes.
Yeah.
And it basically rewards the loudest and the quickest,
Yeah.
whereas it should be for everyone. And that's why I absolutely agree that it's the most inclusive means of
Go
participation.
cold calling.
There you go. So Claire, thank you so much for coming on the pod. I think the work you're doing in schools and colleges is fantastic. And I know whenever they have training by you, everyone's always raving, especially about the cold calling.
Yeah.
Stuff.
I love talking about it. So, and it's always great to share this research with even more people. So that's great.
Amazing. Well, please do come back on the pod. I think we should do another episode in the future, maybe looking at questions. We've done how to answer them.
Yeah.
Maybe
The
what
right
makes
sort
a
of
good
questions to ask.
Yeah.
Would love to do that.
Okay, we'll do that. For everyone listening, we hope you enjoyed the episode. If you liked it, please do let us know. We love getting your feedback. We'd love to hear about how different schools and colleges are using cold calling and what your experiences have been on it. Please do share this with your colleagues. It makes the world of difference. Even better if you can subscribe and give us 5 stars. For everyone else, see you at the next Science of Learning podcast. Bye.
If you've enjoyed this episode and want to improve your staff's understanding of the science of learning, you'd simply love Inner Drive's training. We offer brilliant in-person workshops plus online support through the Teachers CPD Academy, trusted by thousands of teachers worldwide. Simply email us now at info@innerdrive.co.uk to take your staff's professional development to the next level.